A trial had previously been held at Muskogee in September, where 37 pled guilty. This didn't end the rebellion, because it had a tendency to spread to other areas. November of that year, a number of IWWs were arrested for attempts to burn a bridge between Henrietta and Okmulgee, over which a troop train was about to ride. And the next week, 2 members of IWW from Guthrie were flogged with a cat o' nine tails, tarred and feathered. About the same time, men wearing hoods, who were members of the Knights of Liberty, were forming a vigilante committee to keep vigilant for activities of these IWWs. The business people at Muskogee organized the vigilante committee. And the IWWs began to flock to Tulsa in alarming numbers. And about this time, the officials of the Katy Railroad were put on the alert. And they organized a vigilante officers group, armed them of 300 men, for subject to call any emergency in Tulsa. And the next week, the IWWs spread the rumor that they planned to blow up the city hall at Shawnee in the county courthouse. 2 days later, 50 men belonging to the IWW were arrested in Kansas City by officers, who confiscated 2 trucks full of papers containing their plans for resistance of the local, state, and national draft authority. And for some time, the manager of Okmulgee Refining Company at Okmulgee was uneasy because he received a letter in which they threatened to destroy the refinery there by blowing it up with dynamite. Now, you may wonder, after hearing this story of the Greenhorn Rebellion, as to whether or not there were anyone killed. Well, there were 3 people killed. according to the newspaper account. 2 who lived near Cornwall. They were fellows who resisted arrest. And then there was a young school teacher killed in Holdenville by accident. The officers were guarding the road entering Holdenville, and they were instructed to order everybody to halt when they entered the main highway. And this young teacher had started to McAllister, and he was ordered to halt and failed to halt, and he was shot and killed. That is about all I remember about the Green Corn Rebellion.
Did you teach at Greenleaf the year following the rebellion?
No. I moved to McIntosh County near Shakota. I had an older brother who lived there on a farm, and other acquaintances that had moved there from Arkansas. So I went to visit them, and an old school teacher of mine by the name of Ned Sizemore asked me to teach in McIntosh County. Told me that he would arrange for a contract with the school at Etowah, East of Chicago, for me to teach. So I accepted that job and taught during the winter. And in the spring I went back to East Central State College at Ada to school. And then the next summer I returned and taught in the adjoining school district by the name of Hudathorpe. And while teaching here, I learned that there was a vacancy in the Ada schools for an elementary principal. So I made application there and was employed as the first. From 1919 to the summer of 1925. While in school that summer at East Central, I met the superintendent of schools at Beggs, Oklahoma, who invited me to take position of high school principal at Beggs at an increase in salary. So I decided to move to Beggs. And Mr. Payne, the superintendent, told me that he had been elected county superintendent, and at the end of that year would assume the duties of county superintendent, and that he would recommend me to succeed him. So, at the end of the first year at Beggs, I became superintendent of schools, where I served 3 years. My reason for leaving Beggs was that I had brothers teaching in Seminole County, and they asked me to apply for the position of superintendent of schools at Cromwell, which was vacant. So I drove down to Cromwell, made application, and was hired.
Cromwell had been known to be a pretty rough town back then. What do you remember about it?
Well, it did have that reputation, and it's true that it was a rough town during the oil boom days. I understand that the criminal element was very much in control, and Cromwell at times, so much so that they hired the famous pioneer law officer Bill Tillman as policeman. And that was the day of the Mall Murphy Dance Hall. And there was nothing uncommon for people to be shot in Cromwell at that time. Bill Tillman was killed by a federal officer who was drinking when Bill Tillman attempted to arrest him. His name was Wiley Wynn. But these incidents were happening at the peak of the oil boom. When I went to Cromwell in 1928, the boom had subsided. And it seemed that some of the rougher elements of the community and conflicts were occurring within the school. The superintendent of schools and his faculty were unable to work in harmony. The high school principal and the high school teachers went out through the superintendent to the extent that they started carrying guns to school. And the county superintendent, Calvin Vance, saw the danger of this and drew up an agreement whereby each high school teacher and the superintendent and principal agreed not to carry a gun to school. And each one signed it. I have a copy of that agreement, which I found in my desk when I went to college. I also found blood stains on the office floor from blood of a patron who had gone up to bounce out the high school principal for disciplining his boy. And the high school principal answered him with a lick on the head with his six-shooter and cut open the man's scalp. So these incidents were fresh in the minds of people in Cromwell, and also my banker at Day remembered reading the paper, and when I told him that I was going to Cromwell, he said, "Mr. Emerson, I always thought you had pretty good sense until I found out that you're going to Cromwell, and now I decided you're a damn fool." But I didn't find it too rough getting along with the people. Of course, even my school board feared further trouble because the work hand of one of them had recently been shot in an argument with another patron of the school over matters of the school, and was confined to his bed when I visited the home of Mr. Bleeker. And the hatred that had been created among patrons over the strike had not all died down, but it soon cleared away, and we had a very harmonious tenure at Cromwell. And during my 22 years as superintendent of schools there.
When you first came there, how many teachers did they have at the school?
As I recall, they had 28 teachers. They had two wing schools, one at Sand Creek, one at Four Corners, and then the central grade building. These were all frame buildings that were later torn down or raised, and a central elementary brick building built in 1935.
Get the money to build these new buildings?
Well, we had the WTA federal work program at that time that helped supply some of the materials and labor. So we made use of that and voted a building levy. And that enabled us to build a 10-room brick building with 10 classrooms with office and restroom for a cost of about $12,000 to the school district. We purchased materials that the district had to pay for, like brick and lumber, direct from the manufacturer or producer. We bought the brick from an abandoned brick plant at Cusco, Oklahoma, near Henrietta, and bought most of the lumber in the way of framing and decking and joists and so on from a friend of mine who had a sawmill in Arkansas. In those days, we were able to buy lumber for about 1/5 of what it costs today.
Did you have any other buildings built while you were there?
Well, after the war, we did do some other building under WTA. We built the Industrial Arts building, and used stone in that structure because WPA labor was available, and we were asked to make all the use of labor that we could. So by using stone, we were able to make use of this WPA labor And we built an addition to the high school building for the vocational homemaking department. And then also built a 7-room stone cottage for the superintendent, with a double garage. Then, after the war, we had need for a new gymnasium, so we were able to secure frame buildings from Camp Gruber that were abandoned by the Army camp there, to supply the plumbing materials and the wood framing and decking for the roof and the bleachers, by using materials from buildings wrecked at Camp Gruber. I took labor in Carmel up there and wrecked these buildings. And we transported the lumber to Cromwell. And the rest of the cost of the building was financed by a bond issue, which the community voted.
Did the people at that time believe that the new buildings were necessary since Cromwell was losing its oil industry and growing smaller?
Well, some of them contended that we wouldn't need these buildings in the future. But the board and I felt that in the near future, the loss in population in the surrounding high school districts would force consolidation of 2 or more of these districts with Cromwell. And in a few years, our predictions came true. And Cromwell now has a larger high school and a larger grade school than they had at the time I left Cromwell.
You mentioned that you had some brothers that were teachers. How many of you taught in Seminole County at the same time?
Well, at one time there were 4 of us superintendents of schools in Seminole County. My older brother, M.L., was at Car City, and Hugh was superintendent of schools at Bowling. True was superintendent of schools at Butner and later at Wisconsin. And then A.J., my youngest brother, was a classroom teacher at Varnum and later at Wisconsin.
When did you leave Cromwell?
I left Cromwell in 1950. I had a good friend who was secretary of the Teacher Retirement Board in Oklahoma City, Harvey Black, who told me of a vacancy of the superintendent of schools in Colgate. Harvey had been high school principal years before in Colgate, and some of, I believe, 2 of his former pupils were members of the school board. And he told me that he would be glad to help me secure the job if I were interested. So he wrote the Colgate School Board recommending me, and in a few days after receiving his letter, they visited the Cromwell School and talked with me. and invited me to come to Cornwall. So I've been here since that time.
Thank you. This has been an interview with Mr. Earl Emerson.
We have Mrs. Ada Sullivan at 425 Highland. Mrs. Sullivan is a retired teacher of Seminole schools, and she now is going to share some of her experiences with us. Ms. Sullivan?
Well, I believe that you wanted the history and background of Seminole schools along with anything that I could say leading up to the present day. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I shall begin way back in 1890. 1890 was the year that the unassigned lands in the which eventually became Oklahoma, and about that time in 1890 the government was establishing Indian schools here in the state of, well, not the state of Oklahoma. It wasn't the state of Oklahoma at that time, of course, but at that time 2 Indian schools were built, one south of Wewoka, that was Imahaka Mission, a girls' school for the Seminoles, and the other one near us was Mickeysuki Academy, it was called at that time, for boys, and that was about 4.5 miles south and west of Seminole. And the man who was responsible for the building, or at least getting the materials to the site of build where it was built, was a man by the name of Tidmore. And of course that was a large building, and it took a lot of material, and I'm sure it took quite a little time for that material to be brought overland by railroad, and a spur was built. Some have said it was near Earlsboro. I don't know where it was, but it was somewhere between where Tidmore is now and where Earlsboro is now. A railroad spur was built from there out to where the mission was built, and it seems as if this Mr. Tidmore was responsible for that. And as I understand it, settlement grew up there. A little settlement grew up, and it was given his name, Tidmore, because of the fact that he was working there and helping there. And as far as I know, that is how Tidmore became established, and how it's got its name. That was Seminole's first settlement, and that is a mile west of the present Seminole, from Phillips Avenue over to the Rock Barn, and you girls know where the Rock Barn is. And the little town was situated right at Main Street, as I remember, ran north and south, and then east, there was a dead end there, and part of it was, well, so far as I remember, all of it was north of the railroad, but it did extend south of the Rock Barn, and that was the main part of the town, or the business section of the town. And then the dwellings were back east and to the south, and north on the hill. And my family came to Tidmore in 1904, I believe. 1904. My father had made a crop south of town. We had originally lived north of what is now Seminole, and at that time there was a school at where number 9 now crosses 99, and on the northeast corner, and that school was called Good Hope. And we had formerly lived up there, and went to school a short time in the winter time, and our teacher was Mrs. Lou Grissow, a sister of Doc Grissow, whom everybody in Seminole knew or knew